5 years on, the world has almost forgotten about that war. Just 5 days of fighting with relatively few casualties. And yet that war had all the hallmarks of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. Political posturing, backstage scuffles, dramatic effect, all leading to a profound finale. It was an act of war, with real people drawn into crowd scenes. International politics always involves a fair share of scripting and staging, smiling while scheming and keeping up appearances while tensions simmer beneath. By summer of 2008, relations between Russia and Georgia had already been strained. Yet, with the new leader in the Kremlin, the word reset was trendy in diplomatic circles.
I can still remember the moment when I stood up to meet him in my office. He entered the room with a shining, kind smile. I told him I'd like to find a way to ease relations between our countries, to improve them, especially if you take into consideration the distinct feelings that Georgian and Russian people have always had towards each other. Mr. Saakashvili said that he had the same feelings, and he thought that was our primary goal, and that it could be achieved. So, that was the end of our discussion.
The two seemed to have a lot in common. Both were born in the 1960s into families of educators, both went to study law, both became presidents.
I was on a visit to the White House as head of the presidential administration. The first words that George W. Bush, my future colleague, said to me were in fact about him. He said, "Mikhail Saakashvili is a good guy." That was the first thing I heard from him.
But there were differences too. While Medvedev was only adjusting to his new role, Saakashvili had already built up a legacy as the most eminent leader Georgia had ever known. Generous Western funding helped facilitate vital reforms, including upgrades of the army. Within a decade, Georgia hoped to join NATO. There was just one technicality: frozen conflicts in its two breakaway provinces. And in the summer of 2008, Saakashvili made a decision to defrost them.
I believe that peace is more important than anything else. For the sake of peace, we are open to any compromise, any agreement. We will do anything to prevent violence. I suggest we put our efforts together to look after our country, to stop violence, to make our future better. Let's forget all our negative experience in the past and think about the future.
Milena Razmadze watched that address with her 4-year-old grandson. An ethnic Georgian, she lived in South Ossetia most of her life. After several days of skirmishes on the border, that night she went to bed with a light heart, assured that the worst was over.
If I had run, my children would have been frightened even more. No, I said, don't be afraid, everything's going to be fine. Then I got undressed and laid down. When I heard the shooting and loud bangs, I quickly put on my clothes and ran into the cellar.
Less than 5 hours after Saakashvili's appeal for peace, the first Georgian rockets hit Milena's street. With a crying toddler in her arms, she sought refuge in her basement, among pickle jars and pots of jam.
My little grandson cried, "Grandma, The Georgians will kill us. I said, I'm Georgian. Do you think I'm going to kill you? He replied, no, Grandma, you're not really Georgian. Georgians kill people.
The timing of the attack caught the Russian leadership off guard. President Medvedev was on holiday, while Prime Minister Vladimir Putin had traveled to China for the Olympics.
Since its beginning, arms have been put down during the Olympic Games. But here the situation was completely the opposite. On the eve of the opening ceremony, the Georgian authorities undertook aggressive actions against South Ossetia. They basically launched a military campaign with the use of heavy artillery and tanks. People have been killed and wounded, including Russian peacekeepers. This is sad and alarming. And without doubt, this will be met with a response.
When Putin was giving that message, the Russian response had already been mobilized. Following the skirmishes on the border, Medvedev cut his holiday short. He was brought to this residence on the outskirts of Moscow, where he would face the most challenging test to his presidency. He already knew about the deaths of Russian peacekeepers and the thousands of South Ossetians streaming across the border into Russia.
The heavy weight of military decisions always lies on the person that is empowered by the Constitution to take them. You can't escape that. This is your decision and no one else's. We talked on the phone sometime before these events. There was a kind of escalation. We didn't talk with Mr. Putin that night. I only received reports from our army commanders. Actually, it was upon receiving these reports that I made the decision. I think it was the most difficult decision in my life. I wouldn't wish the weight of this decision on any other leader of any other country in the world.
In the meantime, the barrage of rockets on Tskhinval continued unabated. The residents had only two options: hide in the basement or try to flee the town. The Jusoy family decided to take their chances. The father gathered his kids into an old Lada, but the mother had to stay behind to care for an elderly relative. All she would see of them again was their charred remains that were found a few kilometers away from home after their car was shelled by a tank.
This is where my son and his children died. He was in the front seat. How could they shoot at children? They are monsters.
Those who stayed put sought refuge in basements. However, they also had to risk their lives by sneaking out. Food and water was running short, and the bodies of those killed were piling up. Locals used the rare lulls in fighting to dig graves. Since proper funerals were out of the question, most of the victims were laid to rest wrapped in linen and carpets, right in their own backyards.
The neighbors couldn't drive them to the cemetery because the fighting was still going on. But neither could they leave the bodies out here. It's a matter of honor for South Ossetians. You have to bury your dead.
According to Russian estimates, the war in South Ossetia claimed several hundred civilian lives. Compared to the death tolls later seen in Libya, Syria, or even Palestine, it wasn't that high. Yet the question asked in South Ossetia was, why did it have to go that far? Why didn't Russia intervene earlier? While Medvedev always insisted it was Russia's duty to protect civilians in South Ossetia, he also had to consider the larger geopolitical context.
Bush himself called me the next day. You should know that there are some of our troops on Georgian territory. Really? I replied. What do you mean? So I said, you should know that there's a large number of our citizens on the territory of Abkhazia and Ossetia, and I will do what I have to do. And I'll tell you about it so that you know.
By 2008, Georgia had received around $3 billion in direct U.S. assistance. The evidence of that funding was on display all over the region. Military uniforms, army rations, and weapons all bore the slogan, "Made in the USA." And this is how some Ossetians came to view that midnight attack. However, in the Kremlin, the assessment of American involvement was more level-headed.
Russia should never be in conflict with the United States. Every American president understands that. There were some hotheads, we know all about that, but I think there was sound reasoning too. They realized it might lead to a very serious conflict. Nobody needs that.
That realization notwithstanding, all the sides continued playing their part. When the Blitzkrieg plan fell through, the Georgian leadership adopted a new narrative. Russian aggression was choking the democratic advances of its small but proud neighbor.
We have this small, tiny democracy under attack from its giant neighbor, Russia.
We only retaliated and responded when 150 Russian tanks and APCs started to move through Georgian-Russia border. That was exactly the moment, on 7th of August, 23:50 p.m., when I gave order to shoot at the invaders. Their purpose is so obvious. They go through the shortest way of winning war is getting as brutal as one can get, but getting as sadistic as one can, killing as many civilians as one can get, and at the same time try to blur international understanding of what's really happening on.
A year later, a European Union report would establish unequivocally that it was Georgia that launched the attack on South Ossetia, and that it was Georgia, or rather Saakashvili personally, who tried to blur the international understanding of what was happening, telling lies with a straight face and playing the part of a courageous truth-teller targeted by the sadistic military machine. But Saakashvili couldn't always keep the act up. In one instance, he was caught on camera cowering behind his bodyguards. In another, nervously chewing on his tie just seconds before a live interview. Saakashvili was increasingly exhibiting signs of irrational behavior. To the Russian leadership, he started to give off the same impressions as Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi did to Western politicians. An out-of-touch ruler who used the army to kill his own civilians. And yet, despite all temptations, an attempt to remove him from office was never made.
This is where you might say, I think that it's in situations like this that a country's real and true intentions come to light. Initially, we had no intentions of changing the regime in the country, in spite of the fact that, for very obvious reasons, my colleagues and I will never shake Mr. Saakashvili's hands. I consider him a war criminal.
The flywheel of violence was already gaining momentum. Tensions between Georgians and South Ossetians had been simmering for decades, and the experience of being slaughtered in their own homes had traumatized each and everyone.
Their blood is poisoned. I tell you it is. Today they're peaceful, but tomorrow they'll slaughter us all.
Georgian villages in South Ossetia emptied almost overnight, with people leaving behind all their belongings. Looters made their way in, setting houses on fire. The fear of retaliation was so strong that some left behind their own elderly, were discovered days later, hungry and disoriented by rescue workers.
How are you here?
It's hard.
Have you got food?
A little.
Have you got any bread?
A little.
We give you a little.
The August air here is usually filled with the sweet smell of ripening peaches. Few in South Ossetia knew beforehand that the smell of decomposing human flesh is also suffocatingly sweet. According to Georgian authorities, 170 soldiers lost their lives in that offensive. For days, their bodies were rotting in the forests, until the locals could get enough coffins to send them back to Georgia.
Our people built coffins for the Georgians too. No matter what happens, we're Christians, and the dead need to be buried in a traditional way.
Not everybody could be so gracious. There is a point in any conflict when fear transforms into hatred, when everything to lose is lost, when even older women lose compassion for men of their son's age. That is when violence becomes self-propelling, when it reaches the point of no return, when mission creep stops being an option and becomes the aim. This scenario seemed very realistic, and yet it wasn't acted upon. Mass scenes, broad gestures, bold proclamations. Mikhail Saakashvili was definitely a politician of the new generation, young, eloquent, and charismatic. Not just speaking the same language, but also saying things the Western audience likes to hear.
We are a free, small, freedom-loving nation. And
even when his narrative was falling apart, having Russia as a foil was Saakashvili's strongest point, banking on the audience's old prejudices and reinterpreting history to support his line.
We are talking about mass, unparalleled land intrusion of Russia into any country. It's bigger than with the force the tank force they went into Afghanistan in 1979 or Czechoslovakia in 1968.
In a media world where most wars are reported on from a safe distance, it's no wonder that most Western outlets sided with Saakashvili, who by that time had a live TV link set up in his own office. On the other hand, public relations have never been Russia's specialty. In the days of the conflict, many state institutions went into lockdown, completely yielding the initiative to Saakashvili.
There haven't been many events like this in our country for the past few decades. And if we're talking about the Russian Federation as an independent country, it was the first time in its history.
Yet the struggle for global public opinion was in many ways just a theater of war. A theater where exaggerated emotions and loaded rhetoric keep the public's attention.
I cannot even imagine. I mean, seeing a 12-year-old go through all of this, it must have been horrifying.
But that ultimately doesn't care about the real suffering.
We can blame only one person and Georgian government. I'm not blaming Georgian people. I'm blaming Georgian government, and he has to resign.
Well, that's certainly what the Russians want.
Making wars all about personalities, Putin in this case, is an American pastime. Ultimately, it wasn't that Saakashvili was liked so much. Most American politicians could barely pronounce his last name.
Mikhail Saakashvili, President Saakashvili, President Saakashvili.
But a conveniently demonized Putin better fits old American stereotypes about Russia and its leaders, making it an easy PR ride for Saakashvili, but an excruciating ordeal for his people. Nelly, whose husband and 2 children were killed while trying to flee the city, couldn't speak for months. A few weeks after burying her family, she found out that she was pregnant, an unlikely mercy of fortune that pulled her out of the abyss of grief. But even years later, she couldn't bring herself to mention her dead children's names.
Things are very bad for me in this life, but I'm alive. Life with them, it wasn't God's will. I'll live for as long as God wants.
While the Georgian attack was repelled, the diplomatic war of words was still raging. Barely a week after Georgia launched its offensive, the US president put the blame squarely on Russia, not even once criticizing Saakashvili for his actions.
The United States and our allies stand with the people of Georgia and their democratically elected government. With its actions in recent days, Russia has damaged its credibility and its relations with the nations of the free world. Bullying, and intimidation are not acceptable ways to conduct foreign policy in the 21st century.
Relations between Russia and the United States were never particularly warm or trusting. Trading barbs had long been the norm of communication, but the American denial of self-evident facts did catch Moscow off guard.
Well, I must admit that I was hoping for a more objective analysis, but I never had any particular illusions. They swore that black was white and Russia was portrayed as the aggressor. It was only some time later that they began to admit that, although the Russians were tough, they didn't attack first. Now, of course, after all these commissions, including Mr. Telyavini's commission, everything confirms what happened in reality.
But this diplomatic wrangling meant nothing for those caught in between. Even when the violence subsided, war continued to stare South Ossetians in the face. Many now had to exhume the partially decomposed bodies of their loved ones, wash them, dress them, find coffins, and finally give them a proper burial. One of the most brutal experiences a mother can suffer.
Why did they kill you? What did you do to those Georgians? Oh, my boy! Why did they shoot you from their tanks?
Georgian mothers, too, had their sons taken from them. Those sent to attack a sleeping city on behalf of Georgian democracy and returning home in pieces in the name of its territorial integrity. Yet even that didn't seem enough for President Saakashvili to reconsider his tactics.
We had almost 5 hours discussion about mechanisms to stop ongoing violence and deterring Russian invasion, as well as about massive assistance programs for Georgia from the United States in order to start immediate rebuild.
The massive assistance was not to rebuild cities and villages, but to rebuild the army so that it was fully capable of attacking those cities and villages again. This is how this statement and the subsequent US funding were interpreted in Moscow. A response came in less than 2 weeks. In late August, Russia recognized the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. You have stressed many times that you consider this war to be the personal mistake of Mr. Saakashvili, that Russia doesn't blame it on the people of Georgia. Why don't you have the same attitude toward the recognition of independence? Obviously, your decision influences the people of Georgia as a whole, and it will probably do so in many years to come.
Because otherwise we wouldn't be able to ensure the interests of our citizens, or the national interests of the Russian Federation. Just imagine that we would have to go in different directions after what happened. Mr. Saakashvili and his companions would start recovering their military power. By the way, they started receiving help of this kind right away. For many years, we held on to the hope that the Georgian government would be able to preserve this territory within its own borders. Unfortunately, though, and this is the crime that Saakashvili committed, he committed against the future of his people and against future generations of his people. He actually drove the final nail into what had been his very own country. With his own hands, he buried those hopes.
5 years on, that decision still weighs heavily on the relationship between the two countries. While Saakashvili remains president, he's no longer seen as the young, bold reformer he once was. Rather, the opposite is true. His political opponents who control parliament have taken steps to normalize relations with Moscow, but it's far from a real rapprochement.
Mr.
Saakashvili is almost off the political scene now, And if the new Georgian leadership is able to rebuild relations with the peoples of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, would their reunification with Georgia ever be possible? And if so, would Russia recognize the territorial integrity of Georgia?
In this world, everything depends on the decisions people make and on their political will. Everything depends on the will of the people that occupy these territories and on the will of Georgians and their elected leaders. It's up to the will of the peoples of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We want them to live in peace. It's their form to choose what form it takes. We will not influence these processes. But we will, of course, defend the national interests of Russia.
Tskhinval has healed its wounds, even though the taste of independence is still bittersweet. Landlocked between Georgia and Russia, South Ossetia is still struggling to find its feet as an independent nation. Unemployment is high, and opportunities for growth are scarce. Trading with Georgia could have offered the solution, but few are ready to discuss it just yet. Every August, this bright, welcoming land turns black, with families making their way to the cemetery.
You were my boy, my golden boy. Son, why? Why?
It was a lose-lose situation for everyone involved. Georgians lost almost a fifth of their territory. South Ossetians gained political independence, but failed to secure economic self-sufficiency. And Russians denied themselves an opportunity to normalize ties with its long-time neighbor and ally. And that is not to mention the unspeakable that people in all three countries have to go through. All because of one man, a telegenic leader of great promise, who couldn't find a better way to fulfill his historic mission than through an act of war. Five years on, the world has almost forgotten about that war. Just 5 days of fighting with relatively few casualties. And yet that war had all the hallmarks of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. Political posturing, backstage scuffles, dramatic effect, all leading to a profound finale. It was an act of war, with real people drawn into crowd scenes.
He's a good guy. That was the first thing I heard from him.
But there were differences too. While Medvedev was only adjusting to his new role, Saakashvili had already built up a legacy as the most eminent leader Georgia had ever known. Generous Western funding helped facilitate vital reforms, including upgrades of the army. Within a decade, Georgia hoped to join NATO. There was just one technicality: frozen conflicts in its two breakaway provinces. And in the summer of 2008, Saakashvili made a decision to defrost them.
I believe that peace is more important than anything else. For the sake of peace, we are open to any compromise, any agreement.
International politics always involves a fair share of scripting and staging, smiling while scheming and keeping up appearances while tensions simmer beneath. By summer of 2008, relations between Russia and Georgia had already been strained. Yet, with the new leader in the Kremlin, the word reset was trendy in diplomatic circles.
I can still remember the moment when I stood up to meet him in my office. He entered the room with a shining, kind smile. I told him I'd like to find a way to ease relations.
We will do anything to prevent violence. I suggest we put our efforts together to look after our country, to stop violence, to make our future better. Let's forget all our negative experience in the past and think about the future.
Milena Razmadze watched that address with her 4-year-old grandson. An ethnic Georgian, she
relations between our countries, to improve them, especially if you take into consideration the distinct feelings that Georgian and Russian people have always had towards each other. Mr. Saakashvili said that he had the same feelings, and he thought that was our primary goal, and that it could be achieved. So, that was the end of our discussion.
The two seem to have a lot in common. Both were born in the 1960s into families of educators. Both went to study law. Both became presidents.
I was on a visit to the White House as head of the presidential administration. The first words that George W. Bush, my future colleague, said to me were in fact about him. He said, "Mikhail Saakashvili,